Mike Johnson thought he could lecture Jasmine Crockett about constitutional law on live television. What happened next left the House Speaker completely speechless and may have just delivered the most devastating political takedown of 2025. The most powerful Republican in the House of Representatives. A man who's built his entire political brand on constitutional expertise. Sitting in stunned silence as a first-term congresswoman systematically destroys every legal argument he's made. The cameras captured every second of his humiliation, and the internet is about to explode. The moment when a seasoned lawyer from Texas exposed the Speaker's constitutional ignorance in front of millions of Americans is about to go down in political history. But before we dive into how Jasmine Crockett just ended Mike Johnson's credibility with one brilliant legal argument, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because what you're about to witness will be talked about for years to come. This wasn't just a political disagreement. This was a masterclass in how preparation, legal expertise, and fearless determination can completely dismantle even the most powerful opponents. Johnson walked into that hearing room thinking he'd easily handle any questions about his controversial emergency powers bill. Instead, he walked out looking like a law student who just failed his final exam in front of the entire class. And Johnson's face at the end? Pure political devastation. The kind of moment that ends careers and creates legends. We're talking about a constitutional scholar getting schooled so thoroughly that even his own Republican colleagues couldn't defend him. The aftermath is still sending shockwaves through Washington. And you're about to see exactly why. Here's what you need to understand about this epic confrontation. On one side, you have Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, constitutional lawyer, Louisiana Republican who's been playing politics for decades. He's used to being the smartest person in the room, the guy who lectures others about the Constitution and legal precedent. Johnson built his reputation as a constitutional scholar long before entering politics. Working as a lawyer for the Alliance Defending Freedom, where he argued religious liberty cases before federal courts, his rise to Speaker wasn't accidental. Republicans chose him specifically because of his legal background and supposed constitutional expertise. He'd authored multiple legal briefs, taught constitutional law seminars, and consistently positioned himself as the party's go-to authority on constitutional matters. Johnson's colleagues regularly deferred to his legal opinions, and he'd grown accustomed to being the final word on constitutional interpretation within Republican circles. Johnson came into this hearing with his usual confidence. He'd done his homework, had his talking points ready, and expected to easily handle whatever came his way. After all, he's the Speaker. He controls the agenda, the timing, the entire flow of House business. More importantly, he genuinely believed his legal analysis was bulletproof. His staff had prepared extensive briefing materials and multiple constitutional law experts had reviewed his position, or so he thought. On the other side, you have Jasmine Crockett, first-term congresswoman from Texas, former public defender, civil rights attorney who spent her career fighting for justice in courtrooms across America. But calling her just a rookie would be a massive understatement. Crockett graduated from the University of Houston Law Center, where she served as editor of the Houston Law Review. She then spent years as a public defender, handling some of the most complex constitutional cases in Texas federal courts. Her legal career was marked by victories in cases involving Fourth Amendment violations, due process rights, and equal protection challenges. She'd argued before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals multiple times and had never lost a constitutional law motion in federal court. While Johnson was giving political speeches about the Constitution, Crockett was actually litigating constitutional cases and winning them. The hearing started normally enough. Johnson, sitting at the head of the committee, opened with his standard remarks about border security and constitutional duties. His voice carried that familiar tone of authority, the confidence of someone who's never really been challenged on constitutional matters. The Constitution is clear about Congress's responsibility to protect our borders. This emergency authorization bill is not only constitutional, it's necessary for national security. The first few questions came from friendly Republicans who lobbed softball inquiries that allowed Johnson to expand on his talking points. He quoted founding fathers, referenced historical precedents, and spoke with the assurance of someone who genuinely believed he had the law on his side. Then came the Democrats' turn to question. A few members asked pointed questions about executive overreach and separation of powers, but Johnson handled them easily. He'd clearly prepared for these standard objections. The gentle lady from California doesn't seem to understand the difference between emergency powers and executive overreach, Johnson said with a slight smirk, drawing chuckles from his Republican colleagues. He leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who'd handled thousands of similar challenges throughout his career. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tried to press him on the potential for abuse of emergency powers, but Johnson dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. The congresswoman's fears are unfounded. We have built-in safeguards and judicial oversight mechanisms that prevent any constitutional overreach, he replied, citing the Supreme Court's decision in Daines and Moore v. Reagan to support his position on emergency executive authority. The Democratic members grew increasingly frustrated as Johnson seemed to have an answer for everything. He was clearly in his element, fielding constitutional questions with the ease of someone who'd been doing this for decades. Several Democratic staffers could be seen frantically passing notes to their bosses, trying to find new angles of attack. But Johnson anticipated every line of questioning. But then something shifted in the room. Jasmine Crockett had been sitting quietly taking notes, studying Johnson's responses with the intensity of a lawyer preparing for cross-examination. Unlike her Democratic colleagues who were asking broad policy questions, Crockett was analyzing the specific legal citations Johnson was using, checking them against her own research, and building what would soon become a devastating legal argument. The cameras caught subtle changes in her body language, the way she sat up straighter when Johnson cited Youngstown Steel, the slight furrow in her brow when he referenced Ex parte Milligan, the almost imperceptible shake of her head when he quoted from Korematsu. These weren't the reactions of someone who was intimidated or outmatched. These were the reactions of a seasoned litigator who had just realized her opponent had made fatal errors in his legal reasoning. And then, the moment that changed everything. When her turn finally came, the energy in the room changed completely. Even the Republican members seemed to sense that something different was about to happen. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett began, her voice calm, but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room pay attention. "I've been listening to your constitutional arguments with great interest. As a former public defender who spent years in federal court, I have to say I'm confused by some of your legal reasoning." Johnson's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't the tone he was used to hearing from freshman members. "If the gentlelady has specific questions about constitutional law, I'm happy to educate her," Johnson replied, trying to regain his authoritative tone. That's when Crockett's eyes lit up. The word educate was exactly what she'd been hoping to hear. "Oh, Mr. Speaker. I think there might be some confusion about who needs educating here," Crockett said. Her voice still perfectly polite, but now carrying an unmistakable challenge. The room went quiet. Even the Republican members stopped their side conversations to watch what was happening. This wasn't the usual partisan back and forth they were used to seeing. "You see," Crockett continued, "you've cited Youngstown Steel 3 times in your arguments today. But I don't think you've actually read the case because if you had, you'd know it actually undermines your entire position." Johnson tried to interrupt. But Crockett wasn't finished. She'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. And she wasn't about to let him deflect with political talking points. "In fact," she said, pulling out a thick folder of documents, "I've prepared a detailed analysis of every constitutional precedent you've cited today. And Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, you've gotten almost every single one wrong." The tension in the room was electric. Republicans were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Democrats were leaning forward, sensing something big was about to happen. And Johnson? Johnson's face was starting to show the first signs of real concern. "Now, I could go through each case individually," Crockett said, her voice gaining strength. "But I think it would be more efficient to focus on the fundamental constitutional principle you seem to have forgotten." She stood up, papers in hand, and walked to the podium. Every camera in the room followed her movement. This was no longer a routine hearing. This was about to become a defining political moment. "Mr. Speaker, you've built your entire argument on the premise that emergency powers trump constitutional limitations, but that's not how our system works. That's not how it's ever worked. And if you'd actually studied the cases you've been citing, you'd know that." Johnson tried to interject again, but Crockett held up her hand. "I'm not finished, Mr. Speaker. You wanted to educate me about constitutional law. Well, class is now in session." What happened next was nothing short of a legal masterpiece. Jasmine Crockett didn't just disagree with Mike Johnson's constitutional interpretation. She systematically demolished it piece by piece using his own cited cases against him with surgical precision. "Let's start with Youngstown Steel since you seem so fond of citing it." Crockett began, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who knew she was about to deliver a knockout blow. In Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company v. Sawyer, the Supreme Court explicitly rejected the idea that emergency powers give the executive branch unlimited authority. Justice Jackson's concurring opinion, which has become the foundation for separation of powers analysis, actually supports the exact opposite of what you're arguing. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. You cited this case to support emergency executive action. But, Mr. Speaker, this case literally struck down emergency executive action as unconstitutional. How do you explain that contradiction? Johnson tried to respond, stammering something about different interpretations and complex legal principles, but Crockett wasn't about to let him off the hook. Different interpretations? She said, her eyebrows raised. Mr. Speaker, this isn't a matter of interpretation. This is a matter of basic legal literacy. The case says the exact opposite of what you claim it says. The room was dead silent, except for the clicking of cameras and the scratching of reporters' pens. Everyone could sense that something historic was happening, but Crockett was just getting started. She opened her folder and pulled out more documents. Now, let's talk about Ex parte Milligan, another case you cited today. You used it to argue that wartime emergency powers justify suspending normal constitutional protections. But, Mr. Speaker, that case explicitly states that the Constitution cannot be suspended even during wartime emergencies. She read directly from her notes. The Constitution of the United States is a law for rulers and people equally in war and in peace. That's a direct quote from Milligan. Are you familiar with that part of the decision? Johnson's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His usual confidence was completely gone, replaced by the dawning realization that he was being systematically exposed as constitutionally illiterate on live television. The context of that case, he started, but Crockett cut him off. The context, Mr. Speaker, is that you're citing cases you haven't read to support positions they actually reject. That's not constitutional law. That's constitutional malpractice. The camera zoomed in on Johnson's face, capturing every moment of his growing humiliation. This was the Speaker of the House. Supposedly one of the most powerful people in America, being schooled like a first-year law student who hadn't done his homework. But Crockett still wasn't finished. She was building to her crescendo and everyone in the room could feel it coming. Mr. Speaker, you graduated from law school. You've practiced law. You've taught constitutional law. How is it possible that you don't understand these basic constitutional principles? She paused for effect, her eyes locked on Johnson's increasingly panicked face. Unless you do understand them, and you're deliberately misrepresenting them to advance a political agenda that you know is unconstitutional. The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Crockett had just suggested on live television that the Speaker of the House was either incompetent or deliberately dishonest about constitutional law. There was no middle ground, no face-saving interpretation. Johnson's face went through a range of emotions. Shock, anger, desperation, and finally, resignation. He knew he'd been caught. He knew that millions of Americans had just watched him get exposed as either ignorant or dishonest about the very Constitution he'd sworn to uphold. I think Johnson finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. We should move on to other questions. But Crockett wasn't about to let him escape that easily. Oh no, Mr. Speaker, you wanted to educate me about constitutional law. I think the American people deserve to hear your response to these discrepancies. How do you explain citing cases that contradict your own arguments? The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Johnson looked at his notes, looked at his staff, looked anywhere but at Crockett or the cameras. Finally, he mumbled something about consulting with legal counsel and quickly called the hearing into recess. But the damage was done. In less than 15 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had completely destroyed Mike Johnson's credibility on constitutional law, exposed his legal arguments as fundamentally flawed, and done it all with such precision and authority that even his Republican colleagues couldn't come to his defense. In less than an hour, the internet exploded. The hashtag Johnson Exposed was trending worldwide. Video clips of Crockett's takedown were being shared millions of times across every social media platform. TikTok users were creating memes comparing Johnson to a deer caught in headlights. Twitter was flooded with constitutional law professors praising Crockett's legal analysis and expressing shock at Johnson's fundamental misunderstanding of basic constitutional principles. Even conservative legal scholars were struggling to defend Johnson's position. The Federalist Society, which had previously endorsed Johnson's constitutional expertise, remained conspicuously silent. Fox News hosts were visibly uncomfortable trying to spin the confrontation, with several admitting on air that Johnson's legal citations were problematic. CNN legal analysts called it one of the most devastating political takedowns they'd ever witnessed. MSNBC ran the clip on loop for hours, with constitutional law experts breaking down exactly how Crockett had systematically dismantled Johnson's arguments. The Washington Post published a fact-check article confirming that Crockett's legal analysis was accurate and that Johnson had indeed misrepresented the cases he cited. The New York Times ran an editorial questioning whether Johnson was qualified to hold the speakership given his apparent lack of understanding of constitutional law. Late-night talk show hosts had a field day. Stephen Colbert joked that Johnson had just been given a free constitutional law education courtesy of Congresswoman Crockett. Jimmy Kimmel showed side-by-side comparisons of Johnson's confident opening statements and his defeated expression at the end of the hearing. Saturday Night Live announced they would be doing a cold open based on the confrontation. Republican strategists were in full damage control mode, but there was no spinning this. Johnson had been caught red-handed misrepresenting constitutional law on live television, and the evidence was overwhelming. Several Republican House members privately expressed concerns about Johnson's leadership, with some suggesting he should consider stepping down from the speakership. Democratic fundraising emails featuring clips of Crockett's performance raised millions of dollars within hours. Progressive organizations hailed Crockett as a hero who had stood up to Republican constitutional gaslighting. Legal scholars began using the confrontation as a teaching tool in constitutional law classes, showing students how to properly analyze and apply legal precedents. The American Bar Association issued a statement emphasizing the importance of accurate legal representation and constitutional literacy among elected officials. But this was never just about one hearing or one embarrassing moment. This confrontation exposed something much deeper about the current state of American politics. For years, politicians have been able to make constitutional arguments without being challenged by experts who actually understand the law. Johnson's downfall wasn't just about misreading cases, it was about the arrogance of assuming that political power could substitute for legal expertise. Crockett's systematic demolition of Johnson's arguments revealed how often politicians rely on their audience's ignorance of constitutional law to advance unconstitutional agendas. Johnson made the classic mistake of underestimating his opponent. He saw a first-term congresswoman and assumed she would be easy to dismiss. He didn't do his homework on her background, didn't realize he was facing someone who had spent years in federal court successfully arguing constitutional cases. His condescending attitude toward her questions only made his eventual humiliation more complete. The confrontation also highlighted the importance of having actual legal experts in Congress. While many politicians have law degrees, few have Crockett's extensive experience in constitutional litigation. Her ability to cite specific cases, quote exact language from Supreme Court decisions, and explain complex legal principles in simple terms demonstrated the value of real legal expertise in legislative debates. For Johnson, this moment will likely define the rest of his political career. His reputation as a constitutional scholar has been permanently damaged. Every future legal argument he makes will be scrutinized for accuracy. His credibility on constitutional matters, which was the foundation of his political brand, has been shattered. Republican colleagues who once deferred to his legal opinions will now question his expertise. The speakership, which he won partly based on his supposed constitutional knowledge, may now be in jeopardy. For Crockett, this moment has elevated her from a freshman congresswoman to a national figure. Her legal expertise and fearless confrontation of power have made her a hero to progressives and a respected voice on constitutional matters. She's proven that preparation, knowledge, and courage can overcome political hierarchy and institutional power. This confrontation will likely be studied in law schools and political science classes for years to come as an example of how legal expertise can triumph over political posturing. In the end, what we witnessed wasn't just a political debate. It was a masterclass in how knowledge, preparation, and courage can expose the hollow nature of political authority when it's not backed by actual expertise. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument, she demonstrated that in America, the Constitution still matters more than political power. But what do you think? Did Johnson deserve the humiliation he received? Should politicians be held to higher standards when making constitutional arguments? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to see more moments where truth confronts power, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Because in today's political climate, these confrontations are happening more often than ever, and you won't want to miss the next explosive showdown. The battle for constitutional integrity is far from over, and we'll be here to cover every devastating takedown, every moment of political reckoning, and every time someone with real expertise stands up to challenge the powerful. Stay tuned, because the next political earthquake could happen at any moment.